Hi, this is Jerry McLaughlin, co-author of the book Cold Wax Medium, Techniques, Concepts, and Conversations, and co-producer of Cold Wax Medium, a video workshop. Welcome to Ask Jerry and Rebecca, a video series answering all your questions about cold wax medium. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Ask Jerry and Rebecca. This one is also coming from Italy. We are at Cascina Rodiani, and this is the studio of Mima. She's one of the owners and one of our gracious hosts. She is also an artist and taking our workshop last week and this week. Our question this week comes to us from two people. It comes from Gay Oaks and Leslie Gersman, and it's really two parts of a similar question. And one part of the question relates to the actual process of us painting in our videos, and the other asks about kind of what we're thinking and narration of those. So the first question is whether when we're painting, we let all of our layers dry or get to the semi-dry stage, or do we paint wet in wet? Because when people are watching the kind of condensed montage of our video, some people had questions about whether or not we were allowing time for rest or whether we were just working kind of from beginning to end. So, you want to field that, Rebecca?
Sure. I find that I work quite a bit wet and wet, and I usually take each layer about as far as I can until it starts getting overly busy, muddy, whatever. It's usually a color muddiness that would cause me to set it aside. But for quite some time, I can keep adding texture, lines, etc., moving paint around, usually with a squeegee at that point or palette knife. The brayer, of course, doesn't work as well on a wet surface. But I tend to get quite a bit of complexity before I set it aside.
Yeah. And for me, I think it's a combination of the two. There are absolutely parts of my painting, particularly my monochromatic surfaces, where I really work fairly heavily wet and wet to get a lot of surface complexity and variety and kind of a mixing that you just can't get when you let your surfaces constantly get to the semi-dry or dry stage. But then there's another part of my paintings where I really rely on the texture to have enough body that it can actually resist what I'm doing, so that I can take a squeegee or a brayer and go over a textured area and have that texture really persist in a fairly substantive way, so that carries through perhaps even to the end of my painting. So it's really a balance for me of the two.
It is for me too. I would say I take the wet stage further than you might think. But,
yeah, agreed.
But the semi-dry stage is also really important because that's where you get a lot of subtlety. Yeah. So, at that point, when I set it aside, there's a lot of paint there. It'll set up and give a lot of potential for the next layers.
Yeah. I think the real takeaway is that it's back and forth between working wet and wet and working on a semi-dry surface, that it's not all one or all the other for either of us. So the notion of standing and painting from start to finish while it's wet, or the notion of doing a layer and setting it aside and doing a layer and setting it aside, neither of those is what we do. We do a spectrum.
Okay. Yeah.
And then the other question came also as a result of watching the montage of each of us painting in our video. And the question that a couple of people asked in a variety of ways was, what are you thinking? Why didn't you narrate it? I would love to know what's going on in your mind.
I didn't know what you were thinking.
Yeah.
Because we don't know what we were thinking.
Yeah. We were really very specific in choosing, one, not to talk while we're painting, because I do think that takes you into a different space where you're trying to have a dialogue and paint simultaneously, that gets at least me into a whole other space. Mm-hmm. And then the idea of narrating over it is really asking somebody to explain something that isn't really very explainable.
Mm-hmm. It would have been a bit artificial.
Yes, I agree.
Often people will look at a painting and say, how did you do that bit? How did you get that color? How did you get that texture? Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't,
Yeah.
because a lot of times it's an accumulation of things that have happened,
Right.
and to pick it apart is really difficult. So, in a really simple type of demo, it's easy enough to say, oh, I did this, I did that.
Mhm.
But with these complex paintings, it didn't make sense to try to explain all that, or
No.
even the thought process. It's very intuitive,
Yeah.
and I would say that sometimes I have conscious thought about what's the next thing, and other times I don't really even formulate a thought. I just move on it.
Yeah. It's an intuitive action that just comes from looking, reacting, and doing in a kind of automatic way that I think the beauty of it is that it's this automatic, intuitive way, that it doesn't involve this constant intellectual conscious process. So explaining that is really very challenging, if not
And
impossible, and artificial.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't really know what was going through my mind. I'm just kind of responding to what's there. And I think we had talked earlier about this, and each of us paints intuitively, but that response and dialogue that's going on automatically in our minds, I think it's unique to each of us,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something you discover.
Right, and there's not that much that you would learn if you did know our thoughts. Honestly,
No, right?
your own thoughts in your own painting would be different, and it's not. It doesn't really matter in a way,
No.
because it's an individualized experience. So, I think that part of the video just is really just meant to show the flow
Yeah.
that happens when you are in control of the tools and the medium, and that it can be a very flowing experience.
Yeah. And it also shows how we let go and
Mhm.
shift direction,
Cover over.
fairly
Yep.
quickly when we feel like something's not working, or even if we get to a pretty far stage and we look and say, that's just not working, we just change it up. That we wanted to demonstrate that the
freedom of that.
the freedom of that. How you get from beginning to a finished painting is, I mean, it's different for each artist and frankly each painting, really.
Yeah, it's
So-
not a linear path.
No. So I think what we'd encourage you to do is learn what you can from the watching, but then really go into your own studio and just discover what that might be for yourself. Yeah.
Well said.
That's it. So I hope that answered your questions as well as we could. I know it's a bit maybe frustrating and vague, but it's an honest answer. So until next time, and I think we might have one more from Italy before we head back home. So thanks for watching.
Thanks. Bye.